was sitting here and I was thinking that there are so many different life stages in the audience, and they've all come to listen to the different speakers and think about this topic. So I think there must be something about their own contemplation about this topic that has brought them here. I also feel that listening to these two narratives, both Sherin's and this young man's, there's a lot of pain, a lot of courage in the way they are speaking about themselves. And perhaps some of what I will be reading will contain and communicate that. And I'm sure that people will collect their thoughts and bring it up towards the end. I wonder if something in our lives remains incomplete if we don't think about death. Some of us hide from the fears of death. As little children, we are scared of our parents dying. But when do we begin to imagine our own death? And if we don't imagine our own death, does that prevent us from imagining our future or the future of others? In this imagination of death as something hopeful, the future is hopeful. There is continuity. Death makes us face our greatest vulnerability. As a culture, our belief in past lives also finds a cure to the fear of death. However, this imagination of death is different from an urgent wish, impulse, need to die, to put an end to something to oneself. This impulse, which classifies as suicidality, often does not carry an imagination. It's driven by immediacy. Suicidality is akin to killing a part of oneself, as this young man has described so well, and can take different forms in one's life. There can be many ways in which it takes form. Someone giving up a good job for no reason can be suicidal. The wish to break up and end a good relationship can be suicidal. And of course, actively wanting to kill oneself is suicidal. The common pattern in these different expressions are the wish to exit, the wish to endanger something very precious without having the conscious knowledge of its consequences. So maybe those who are here to speak about the experiences of wanting to die are brave, as they have encountered something that most of us like to avoid. I am very thankful to you for creating this space and this possibility of a beginning to an ongoing conversation about the topic of suicide and death. And I hope through this evening we are able to create a new language around these issues. I hope to provide a psychological layover and a glimpse into the psychic reality of a suicidal person with a focus on the intrapsychic and interpersonal dynamics. My own location, observations and thinking come from being situated within the context of a university, where my work involves teaching psychoanalysis, working and knowing young students and being a therapist, where suicidal ideation impulses are more prevalent than ever. Suicide and suicidality usually remain shrouded in a lot of shame and silence for those who carry it within themselves and within the families of those who lose someone to a suicide. So such conversations and platforms are much needed to create an engagement which is not based on action, but on a kind of meditative listening and reception in an effort to normalize the experience in some way of harboring thoughts about death and not knowing why one is tormented by such thoughts. There is an inherent unknowability in this act and process which makes it hard for us to engage with it. As suicidality has become so active in the minds of people, I think it no longer remains simply about death, but is also a form of expression of anxiety, of fear, of aggression, and of a perpetual threat of something turning against oneself. I thought that right at the beginning when Sherin started by saying that I am someone who has an NGO, but what if I were to die like that? She was communicating the threat of how strong and pervasive this sense of suicidality is. There is a dire need to understand in all of us the meaning of this act and of the thoughts. I think almost everyone at some point of time in their life harbors this fantasy that I will be remembered when I am gone. A suicidal person perhaps deal with this on an ongoing everyday basis, finding it very hard to put oneself together, to see hope in life, to see what is there outside, and perhaps is often carrying within oneself the feeling of not being cared for, of being forgotten, and often an experience of immense pain that doesn't allow for any other resolution. Often individuals experience a voice in their heads which condemns them and says, "You're not worth living, and it will be better if you die." So suicidal thoughts carry an expression of a lot of self-hatred, which doesn't allow the individual being affected by these thoughts any space for any life. I will now speak a little about how a therapist engages with suicidality. In the kind of work that a therapist does, suicidal thoughts and actions are respected as the autonomy of the individual is sacrosanct. The therapist occupies a position of being someone who has to see the underlying meaning and communication in the act of suicide, rather than simply do something to stop it. In this effort of seeing suicidal acts and thoughts as communication, something new opens up within the individual who is gripped by these, that the person also becomes curious and finds it easier to share this part of himself. Becoming curious about one's suicidal impulses is a huge achievement in therapy, and usually happens as the impulsiveness reduces. But behind the wish to kill oneself, there can be a plethora of reasons. People who are gripped by suicidal acts and thoughts are also trying to find ways of getting out of intolerable states of mind, where their minds are very flooded with affect and painful feelings, and they think of suicide as a way of out of it. However, there is something about what a person is feeling that remains quite wordless. I was very struck that when this young man was talking, he kept on saying that even the eyes can convey empathy. And I think that reflects a lot of hope that even though the suicidal person is always caught in a dynamic tension between life and death, there is always a wish to survive, to be noticed, to be recognized. So such individuals experience an inner divided life in which their weak and helpless part feels to be under constant contemptuous scrutiny of an alien yet inner presence. And there's also a part that is experienced as being me, and another which is experienced as being a killer. There can also be other meanings to what a suicidal person is looking for in the act of suicide. It can be a way of soothing oneself. At times, death feels more soothing than the pain that a suicidal person is experiencing. They feel so intolerable inside that they constantly wish to go to sleep. Acts like cutting are often ways of bringing relief to oneself, to something distressing in one's mind, or to make oneself alive, because people feel so numb and dead. Rather than being able to experience these intolerable experiences, they tend to cut themselves. So our work would be to create a language and an acceptance around feeling dead and numb, rather than having people suppress it. Maybe suicidal acts can also make us see that there are certain parts of human experience that make us feel dead, numb, and they don't find an easy expression. In the kind of world that we live in today, where social media is always there to make us feel connected, suicidality is a question mark to whether such expressions are ways of hiding our true selves, or knowing the world only in some shades and not others. Since it brings to the fore parts of human life, mental life, that are relatively numb and dead, or very painful. Often families who lack emotional communication are dominated by these experiences. And underlying the lack of emotional communication, there's often a lot of trauma which is repressed and unworked. I must also add that somewhere suicidal individuals find a kind of a solution within themselves when they cut, when they hurt themselves. There is a kind of a comfort that they create with the act, and that act feels more reliable than a communication with the world outside. So it's our work to be able to see that what is the level of mistrust that suicidal people can feel, that they also become used to being a certain way. It's also a work to understand the kind of history or familiar life that suicidal people might have experienced in their past. So it is usually found that suicidal individuals have either been emotionally abused by their parents, or they have suffered huge emotional abandonment, or they are actually wanting to also fuse themselves with people who have been lost. Most of us have the capacity to miss people or to mourn, but at times in some people's lives, the very act of losing someone becomes so devastating that suicide becomes a way of reconnecting with the person who has been lost. This has already been stressed, but it's important to understand that most individuals who attempt suicide are not fully aware of what they're doing. They're not in conscious control of themselves. And there's an excellent novel by Jerry Pinto called M in the Big Home, which captures the narrative of a person who is constantly undergoing breakdowns and shows this very well. Lastly, I think for the people who are left behind when somebody commits a suicide, there is a lot of guilt, not having saved or not having known what the person was suffering from. There's also the burden of aggression that people carry, since suicide is an aggressive act directed at oneself and others. In our culture, taking care of people who are dying or old is not impersonal, and unfortunately, suicide does not allow that to happen. So I think there are three things that I would like to suggest to engage with this sphere of human experience. One, that we should cultivate and encourage a language around those experiences that are self-destructive, numbing, or deadening. And the fact that if these experiences get converted into language, that will in itself lessen the suicidality. Secondly, rather than positively reassuring the person, engage with their difficulty and see and try if you can feel it as being valid. You will get to know that by truly putting yourself in the other person's shoes, there's a lot of pain in that experience. In such situations, positive reassurance can often be felt as being fake, as it often helps the one who is giving reassurance and it eases their own anxiety around death and suicide. Lastly, I would like to suggest that reading about understanding the psyche as a complicated place made up of social and psychological forces, to understand that people carry empty and void spaces is important, as people who are trying to cope with suicidal impulses and ideations are also living with a lot of fear of how much that can overtake them.
You say that you're helping the people, right, to live. So what about the people who are willing the wishful death? Because somewhere attempting a suicide, all of you take it as a mental illness, right? It's somewhere these people need help. Don't you think the people who want a wishful death also need a help? They are the people who are having this fear. That my life is good till now. It has been very idealistic, very nice. But maybe, in the near future, something will happen and I don't want to face it. Don't you think these people have a fear? The Santhara, the people have this fear that maybe in the coming life I'll be punished of my karmas of the present birth. So this fear is there in them all throughout, which is leading them, asking for a wishful death. Don't you think these people, along with the people who attempt suicide or who have suicidal thoughts, need the help as well?
I think somewhere your question is also about a person who is talking about ending one's life but also looking at another life. And that has to be maintained and held for a person who is contemplating suicide. The previous question that Supreet asked was about ideation and impulse, and whether suicide is actually creating into some kind of a thought formation. So When a person is able to hold the impulse and think about different parts of one's life, and if you heard the second narrative very carefully, right at the end, the person said that it felt like rebirth. So, suicidality is not something which is frozen or cast in stone. It in itself has many different shades. And perhaps people are also very confused. And those confusions have to be reflected back to them in some way. That you want to end your life, but you also want a better life. Or you are very scared of something that you have done, and you want to end your life and go towards something. So if you're able to point out that duality, at times that is helpful for the person rather than helping the person see that there is something like a solution that the person is looking